Washington, D.C. is known as being the home of a lot of memorials. Right on the National Mall and right around that area, you'll find the Lincoln Memorial, Jefferson Memorial, Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial. There's the Korean War and the World War II Memorial, the Holocaust Memorial, and so many others. Memorials serve three primary purposes: to remind us, to teach us, and to move us. They remind us to reflect upon influential events or people from the past. They teach us to remember the values or the lessons from the past that should be known in the present and also reflected upon in the future. And also, memorials, they move us in some certain way. For one person, they might stand in front of a memorial, and that particular one brings about feelings of remorse or sadness or grief. And yet, somebody else can stand in front of the exact same memorial, and they see hope and they see inspiration and gratefulness and maybe even patriotism. The issue is not as much how the memorial moves you, but that the memorial moves you. So memorials, they have those three parts. They remind us and they teach us as well as they move us. And each aspect of that is heightened based upon the size and the inscriptions and the creative way in which that memorial has been portrayed. A great example of this would be the Vietnam Memorial there in Washington, D.C. A lot of observers find themselves overwhelmed as they stand next to this long black granite wall that is inscribed with the names of those who either lost their lives or those who are still missing from that particular war. As you stare at the different names, you will see your own reflection in the polished stone. In some surreal way, it is almost as though the living are brought face to face with the dead. People from around the world, they come to the memorial to remember friends and family members. And it's not uncommon for a lot of these people to leave certain mementos. Maybe it's a small flag or it's a sealed letter. Maybe it's a piece of clothing, possibly even a picture. And at the end of the night, there's different volunteers who come by. They collect the items and they store it over at the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Collection. In his book, Offerings at the Wall, a guy by the name of Thomas Allen shared a personal glimpse at some of those particular mementos that have been left at the Vietnam Memorial Wall. He spoke of one being a man who left his dog tags as well as a headband and a letter. He says, "To all of you here from Echo Company, 1st Marine Regiment, 1st Marine Division, I leave you my headband, which contains my sweat from the war, my dog tag, and a picture of myself and Mike. Another time, another place, I'll never forget you." There's another example of a woman who left a braid of her hair and a picture of the American flag on the front porch of a home, and it had this small note: "Wayne, I think of you every day, and I miss you so much. I love you." Each personal memento makes the memorial a little bit more personal. Memorials tell the big picture, but it's individuals who help personalize that big picture. As you might imagine, memorials have a different impact upon different people based upon their closeness to the events or to the individual that that memorial points towards. But that doesn't mean that somebody who has not been there or as closely connected cannot also be moved and learn from what others have experienced before them. Today, as we take time to celebrate 15 years of God's faithfulness to Life Baptist Church, we find ourselves in a similar type of position. And that is, we want to remember, but at the same time, we also don't want to point to ourselves. We want to make sure of where we're pointing the focus and the direction to. You're going to hear this morning, the focus always has to go back to God. It always has to focus on Him. So this morning, my prayer is three ways: that we would remember, that we would learn, and that we would be moved. My prayer is that as we remember where God found us and how God formed us and what God has taught us and how God has protected along the way, that it moves us with a heart of gratitude and a heart of worship and thankfulness for what He has done on our behalf. I believe one of the greatest hindrances to a thankful life is a forgetful mind. and we don't want to forget what God has done. So I invite you today, go with me in your Bibles to Joshua chapter number 4. Joshua 4 will be in verses 1 through 7. I'm speaking this morning on the subject of memorials that point to God. Joshua chapter 4, verses 1 through 7. Now, when all the nation had finished crossing the Jordan, the Lord spoke to Joshua, saying, "Take for yourselves 12 men from the people, one man from each tribe, and command them, saying, Take up for yourselves 12 stones from here, out of the middle of the Jordan, from the place where the priest's feet are standing firm, and carry them over with you, and lay them down in the lodging place where you will lodge tonight." So Joshua called the 12 men whom he had appointed from each of the sons of Israel, one man from each tribe. And Joshua said to them, "Cross again to the ark of the Lord your God into the middle of the Jordan, and each of you take up a stone on his shoulder according to the number of the tribes of the sons of Israel. Let this be a sign among you, so that when your children ask later, saying, What do these stones mean? Then you shall say to them, Because the waters of the Jordan were cut off before the ark of the covenant of the Lord, when it crossed the Jordan, the waters of the Jordan were cut off. So these stones shall be a memorial to the sons of Israel forever." Let's pray. Father, as we get into this text, we ask, Lord, that you would allow your Spirit to guide us. May we keep the focus completely upon you while remembering your faithfulness to us. In Jesus' name, amen. I want us to take a few moments and let's establish the context of our passage today. Joshua has just become the new leader of Israel after the death of Moses. 40 years have passed since God brought the children of Israel out of the land of Egypt and up to the banks of the Jordan River. 40 years have passed since God promised them a land that was flowing with milk and honey. 40 years have now passed since the children of Israel had developed a grasshopper complex, somehow feeling as though the same God who conquered the Egyptian army was unable to take care of their needs in the land of Canaan. It has been a long 40 years. The former unbelieving generation has now died off in the wilderness, but God, in his graciousness, is giving their children an opportunity to do what they were unwilling to do. So it says in Joshua chapter 1, verses 2 through 5, "Now therefore arise, cross this Jordan, you and all this people, to the land which I am giving to them, to the sons of Israel. Every place on which the sole of your foot treads I have given to you, just as I spoke to Moses. No man will be able to stand before you all the days of your life. Just as I have been with Moses, I will be with you. I will not fail you or forsake you." Based on that passage, as well as Deuteronomy chapter 1, verses 5 through 7, it would seem as though God's command to Israel under Joshua's leadership is exactly the same as his command to Israel under Moses' leadership. The command was the same: cross the Jordan. Now, in chapter 3, verse 1, Joshua has got up early in the morning. He got his people down to the edge of the Jordan River, and here's what it says in verses 2 and 3. "At the end of 3 days, the officers went through the midst of the camp, and they commanded the people of God, saying, When you see the ark of the covenant of the Lord your God with the Levitical priests carrying it, then you shall set out from your place and go after it." For 3 days, the leaders of Israel were to point to the commands of God. They were to remember exactly what God had commanded them to do. At the end of those 3 days, you'll find that he says in verse number 5, "Consecrate yourselves, for tomorrow the Lord will do wonders among you." Now the next day has shown up. The priests, they arrive with the Ark of the Covenant. They take it down to the edge of the Jordan River. It says that as soon as they put their feet in the water split open and it stayed still. Here's what it says in verse 17. "And the priest who carried the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord stood firm on dry ground in the midst of the Jordan, while all Israel crossed on dry ground, until all the nation had finished crossing the Jordan." Here's the thought that I want to begin to work with. At this point, the group was where God wanted them to be. At this point, the journey that got them there was long, and it was painful, and it was memorable, and it was miraculous, And it had high highs and it had low lows. It had everything in between. And there's been some lessons that they have learned along the way. The question now becomes, how do you share those lessons with the next generation when they have not made the same journey, nor have they seen the same things? Another question might be, how do you transfer key truths and important lessons to those who haven't walked the same path? Here's another thought. How do you teach God dependence to a generation in which they only grew up in the land of promise? Now, I want you to hold those thoughts and let's think about where we are today. Today, we celebrate life's 15-year anniversary. I'm excited about it. And out of the 2,000 plus people who called life home through the multiple services, multiple campuses, out of 2,000 plus people who called life home, there's 8 of us who have been here since the very beginning. 4 adults and 4 teenagers. There's about another 30 of us who have been here for around 13 to 14 years. And then there's a group of about maybe 60 who have been a part of the church for 10 or more years. One of the things that I'm always astounded at is every year we do an annual survey, and one of the questions on the survey is, how long have you been a part of life? And year after year, we find that almost 70% of the people who have been a part of life have been here for 3 years or less. That is astounding to me, but it's a part of the transient nature of the city that we live in. Las Vegas, people are coming and going all the time. But it is impossible for us to share with every new person who comes in every lesson, every truth, and every story of what God has done along the way. But we need to share the big truths and the big lessons and the big stories because that helps shape why we do what we do. It helps people understand why we focus where we do and why we put resources where we do and the lessons God has taught and why discipleship is so important to us and why we've been involved in church planting and sending mission teams around the world. All of that is informed by the journey that God has brought us on. So how do we share that with those coming in? It's a part of discipleship. It's a part of vision, but it's also a part of unity and being together as a community of believers. So I'm trying to ask the question of this text this morning. What can we learn from Joshua chapter 4 that would help us share some of those same lessons with each of the further generations that come and are a part of life? Here's the first truth I want you to see. Memorial stones were God's idea. Memorial stones were God's idea. Joshua and the other leaders were not sitting in a boardroom somewhere thinking to themselves, how can we make tomorrow special? It's taken us 40 years to get here. This is a momentous moment. We got a new territory we're going into. What can we do? What can we do? What can we do? All right, how about we pick up a bunch of rocks and we go pile them on the other side of that river? That's special, isn't it? Now, there's nothing about this story that comes out of Joshua and the other leaders' mind. Rather, the idea, the lessons, the focus is coming from the mind of God. You see, the Jordan River represented a divider between man's choice and God's best. 40 years prior to this, God had promised his people the land of Canaan. They were to trust and obey. Instead, they sent 12 spies into the land to find out, can we take what God had promised to give? 10 of those spies came back and said, we can't do it. There's giants. It's too many obstacles, too many problems. 2 of them came back and said, we're more than able to take the land. Joshua and Caleb, same Joshua who's now leading the children of Israel. But they listened to what the 10 said. And as a result of that, they refused to trust and obey God, and it led to some painful years in the wilderness. Now they're back at the exact same point. And the question becomes, will they trust and obey God, or will there be a repeat performance from what their ancestors did before them? This time, they choose to trust and obey. God told them at this point to take stones from the place where they faithfully obeyed God, the middle of the Jordan River, and they were to assemble them as a memorial in the place that God faithfully promised them. That is the land of Canaan. Now, if you like to study your Bible and you look for nuance and you look for cool pieces and trivia and all that kind of good stuff that you can find, let me give you a little something fun with this story. You will notice that God never told his people to build a memorial in the wilderness to remember his punishment. He told them to build a memorial in the land of Canaan to remember his faithfulness. The memorial was God's idea. But here's the second thing I want you to see. Memorial stones were visual aids that help teach lessons about God. Memorial stones were visual aids that help teach lessons about God. These stones, they capitalized on the natural curiosity of people, and more specifically, the natural curiosity of children. When children would see the pile of stones, they might say things like, what are those stones there for? Why did they get here? What do they mean? Or who put those stones there? And it was to allow the parents an opportunity to then be able to speak about a deeper conversation about God. If you're wondering what those conversations would be like, it actually tells you at the end of the chapter in verses 21 through 24. The stones would help remind the people of God's ability to make a way for his people. He made a way for them at the Red Sea. He made a way for them again at the Jordan River. It was to remind the people of God's ability to protect his people from their enemies, even when the enemies are fierce and they seem to outnumber them. It was to remind them of God's mighty hand to save and to remind them that God is not to be trifled with, but he is to be approached with holy fear and awe and reverence. The memorial stones were visual aids to help teach lessons about God. Did you all know that we all have visual aids in our lives that tell our story? We might not call them visual aids, and we might not be overly concerned about the story they're telling, but we all have visual aids that tell a part of our story. For example, a hunter might have the trophy buck mounted above their fireplace. That's a visual aid. A NASCAR fan might have a piece of memorabilia that's been autographed and is placed on display somewhere within their house. It's a visual aid. There's a lover of history who might have an antique desk and they put it in the corner of a bedroom in their house. It's a visual aid. In each of those situations, that visual aid stimulates curiosity and it begins to tell a part of their story. And we love it when people ask us about what we love. So ask that hunter about that head mounted above the fireplace, and you might find yourselves in 7 hours of dialogue as they regale every detail about the wind was blowing from this direction, I was wearing this outfit, here's the gun I was using. I mean, they'll tell you more than you ever wanted to know. So don't ask the question if you don't have the time to listen. Okay, the person who's a lover of history, you walk into that room and you see that desk, you're like, man, that's a beautiful desk. They're like, do you mind if I tell you about that desk? They've been waiting for somebody to spot the desk so that they can tell the story behind it. See, that's what we do. We find that we display what is important to us. We talk about what is important to us because those items represent what we love and what we value, and they tell a part of our story of what makes our life unique. Now, I got a question that I'm going to ask, and I need to let you know, on a personal level, it might sound as though I'm trying to induce some guilt. And I might be in a marginal, small way. But sometimes we need to at least ask the question to find out whether or not there's something we need to probe through. But I also think on a corporate level, the same question is going to be extremely valuable for how we move forward beyond 15 years. So here's the question on a personal level, based on this story and based on the fact the memorial stones were intended so that when your children saw them, they would ask deeper questions about God. So here's my question. If the only exposure your child had to God was through the visual aids you have erected in your life, would they have more questions about your hobbies? Or would they have more questions about your God? You just take that and process it with God. The memorial stones were intended to be visual aids to teach lessons about God to the next generation. Now, please pay close attention to that last phrase. Lessons about God to the next generation. The focus is on God. The focus was not on the children of Israel. If we're not careful, we can turn eyes away from God and we can put all the eyes back on us. If we're not careful in our celebrations, we can place the spotlight on us, on our achievements, on our victories, on our resolve, and we turn the eyes away from God. So our question as a corporate body has to be, do the visual aids, when people come on this campus, do they tell people about God, or do they somehow point the finger back towards us? Do they encourage people to say, look at him, look at what he's done, look at how faithful he's been, look at how he's provided for us, or does it turn the picture back around towards us? So I want you to take a few moments as we close out the service, and I want you to use your sanctified imagination as we process through what it might have been like for a child to ask their parent about the memorial stones in the land of Canaan. So just kind of visualize some of this with me. Let's say a young boy comes to his dad and says, Dad, that's a strange looking pile of rocks over there. Why are they there? And the dad says, Son, I want you to sit down because there's a story that I need to tell you about that pile of stones. This is a story that begins in slavery. You might have forgotten, but your grandparents and I were enslaved in Egypt. We were under the control of Pharaoh. And for 400 years, we couldn't worship God the way we wanted to worship God. We couldn't make decisions that we wanted to make. We were under somebody else's control. But when we cried out to God, God heard our cries, and he raised up a man by the name of Moses to lead us out of the land of Egypt. When I see those stones, I'm reminded of the fact that it tells us where we came from. It tells us we started in slavery. But also, when I look at those stones, it's a story about power. You see, Pharaoh thought he was the most powerful being in the universe, and yet God used miraculous signs in order to point directly at the sources of power in Egypt to say, I've got more power than you. So when I look at those signs, I'm reminded of the fact that God was showing a story of his power. Those stories or stones also remind me of God's sovereignty. Son, it might seem as though the world is out of control at some points, but I want you to know your God is always in control. You see, when we left Egypt, Pharaoh pursued us, but our God protected us. He parted the Red Sea and he destroyed Pharaoh's army and he provided for us along the way. Remember, God is ultimately the one who is in control. But here's a sad part of the story. And son, don't forget this part. Just as God had taught Pharaoh that he was in control, God wanted to teach us the same thing. He wanted us to learn to trust and to obey him. And he promised us that he would give us this land, the land that we're in right now. But the problem was we weren't sure if we could trust God, so we sent out 12 spies to check out the land. And 10 of them came back and said that we couldn't do it. 2 of them came back and said we could do it. And we chose to listen to those who were the 10. We chose to listen to the majority. And as a result of that, we disobeyed God and we literally went against the very one who had liberated us. So God had to teach us to trust him. So the lessons that we learned over and over for 40 years were trust and obey. Trust and obey. There's a little children's song about that that's sung. Trust and obey. For there's no other way to be happy in Jesus but to trust and obey. So when I see that pile of stones, I'm reminded of the struggles we faced in the wilderness. Did you know, son, it took us 40 years to make an 11-day journey? That's not one of the better parts of our story. But the reason it took 40 years is because we couldn't learn the lessons of trust and obey. Every time God would tell us something, we would disobey. And he'd say, take another lap. And then we would come back and we did really good for like a week. But then we would rebel again. And he'd say, take another lap. And for 40 years, we kept taking another lap. It was the same lesson over and over. Will you trust me and will you obey me? Will you trust me and will you obey me? When I look at that pile of stones, I'm remembered of some difficult lessons we had to learn. So, son, if you hear anything from me, trust and obey God. But let me tell you about something else. When I look at that pile of stones, I'm reminded of the grace of God. Because while He did not allow my parents to come through, He gave our generation another chance to come into the land. So we were willing to submit to God's plan for our lives, and God gave us a second chance, an opportunity. When we trusted and obeyed God, we found that God made a way. So son, any success you see in my life, this house that I'm in, this vineyard that we have, the land that we're upon, any success you see, know that it is about Him. It is about His faithfulness. It's because God cared for us. It's because God is sovereign. It is because God has protected us. It's because God has provided for us. When you see these things, don't look at us, look at Him. He's faithful. See, that's what memorial stones are designed to do. They remind us, they teach us, and hopefully they move us so that we're willing to embrace the lessons that came along the way. So here's your key truth for this morning. Memorials don't have to be big to make an impact, but they do have to be shared to make a difference. Memorials don't have to be big to make an impact, but they do have to be shared to make a difference. As I was praying about our 15-year anniversary and about this story and about how do we relay the truths from this text so that the focus remains upon God and it doesn't come back to us, there were several thoughts that came to mind, and I just want to kind of process through some of these thoughts as we close. The first is literally there are tens of thousands of people around the world who are a part of the story right here at Life. For some of these people, they were with us in the past. Some are with us right now in the present. Some of these individuals have worshiped at this campus, others up at the Northwest campus. There's been an entire group of people that have been able to be in biblical community with us in one of our other buildings we've met at in the past. And there's a whole other group, this is going to sound strange, that have kind of been grafted into this story through online messages and through resources and through mission teams that have gone out all around the world. If you're in the room today, you're a part of the story. And then you might be a first-time guest with us today. You're still a part of the story. You get to hear what God has been doing along the way. And I believe with all of my heart, you are not here by accident. Part of the reason you're here is because of God's grand plan that we would know Christ and make Him known. Know Christ and make Him known. That's what we're about as a church. So another part of this piece is in an effort for us to keep eyes on Christ and that focus of knowing Christ and making Him known. We've wanted to try to capture some of the lessons and the things that He's shared with us over the last 15 years. So what we're going to do is there will be 15 memorial stones that will become a part of the permanent campus right here as expansion is completed. And these memorial stones are going to have one word that shows up on each of them. But that one word goes back to a lesson, a value, a truth that God has shared with this church along the way. And what we're going to do is provide a small companion guide. So when you get to the first stone, that first stone is probably going to have the word seed on the stone. When you get to that first one, you will have a small paragraph that will share about that idea, about how God taught us about the importance of a seed early on. There's going to be one of those that talks about prayer and the lessons God's shared with us on prayer. One talks about kingdom. One talks about the gospel. One talks about expansion. Each of these different stones will have one word, but there's going to be a corresponding paragraph in this companion guide that helps share the story of God's faithfulness to each generation, to each one who comes as a part of this church. Something else that has hit me with a 15-year anniversary is 15 years is a long time for any pastor to be at any church. Did you know the average tenure of a pastor is 18 months at a church? So 15 years is a long time. And let me just simply say, I consider it to be one of the greatest honors and privileges of my life to serve you all as pastor here at Life. It's 15 of the most wonderful years, and so much of that comes back to the encouragement and the love that you all have for Jesus and discipleship and the world. It is like a dream come true for a pastor. I go and I hang out with some other pastors, and they share stories of what's going on, and I sit there and I'm listening, and I'm thinking, I don't want to tell them what's going on because it's a blessing what God's doing. And they tell about all these war stories of like, this person did this, and they slid this note under my door and all this, and I'm like, I got a note of encouragement last week, and this person loved on me, and this one sent flowers, and I feel like one of the most blessed pastors in the world. I thank you all for the privilege of serving as pastor. And as we close out on this, I want to show you all a small video that has some pictures from the journey, but it also gives the reflections of the other couple who has been with Bria and I since the very beginning. I want you all to hear from them. When they think about life, what are the key ideas that come to mind? I shared earlier, memorials tell the big picture, but individuals help personalize that picture. So watch this video.
Look in my eyes.
Here's a fun fact. I was the first person Paul baptized in Las Vegas. My name's Deuce. This is my wife, Angie. We've been at Life since the beginning.
When we had worship in Paul and Bria's house, and we would line the chairs up, and maybe there would be 10 people, but we would still be singing in the living room. The furniture moved out and the chairs lined up, and that was a real sweet time.
Because the drums were like right here. So I think there was a long time of the refining of the people that were in the church, of Paul's heart in what is it that you're trying to accomplish through your own efforts versus what you'll rely on me to accomplish for you. So the prayers started to change, I think, over time on we just want glory for you. You used to say where and when to go, and we'll go. The ministry going out across the world. I've been to Zambia and Haiti. That wasn't on my list of to do, bucket list, but those types of things are growing, it seems like almost every month now. One of the early visions was that it would be genuine community, that we would be invited into each other's lives in a real way, not just a Sunday morning, how you doing, I'm doing good.
I think something that's remained constant is that this church has not been about the building or even a specific set of people, but it's been about Jesus always. What's
the biggest thing that I've seen God do since I've been at Life over the last 15 years? I guess it's just my testimony. He saved me, he saved my wife, my son, both of my daughters, all following the Lord today. He saved my sister-in-law, my brother-in-law, their kids. My brother's a worship pastor here, his kids. My mom has led ministries here. He saved my dad. My dad serves as an usher here. Our sister-in-law's best friend, her family, people from work are attending, people from work that I've introduced to Life have been saved and baptized. And I know that that's multiplied across the four services. I mean, I know our friends who have the same testimony, and I'm sure many more that I'm not aware of. God has radically not just changed my life, but the lives of those that I love the most, and given them a place to come and be a part of the Lord's story.